Gather around as we spill the tea on cybersecurity. We're talking about the topic in a way that everyone can understand. I'm your host, Jara Rowe, giving you just what you need. This is the Tea on Cybersecurity, a podcast from Trava. Hey listeners, you're listening to the compliance segment of season 3 of the Tea on Cybersecurity. We've heard this saying several times on the podcast. You can't protect what you don't know. And to me, this starts with your things, aka assets. In this episode, we're spilling tea on assets from inventories to management and how this fits into cybersecurity compliance. But as we know, I'm not the expert. So I have Marie Joseph here to help us understand the importance of keeping tabs on our digital assets and more. Hi, Marie.
Hi, Jara.
How are you?
Doing great. Happy to be back on the tea.
I know you've been on several episodes in all 3 seasons, but just in case this is someone's first episode listening, can you just introduce yourself briefly?
Yes, I'm Marie Joseph. I'm a senior security solutions engineer here at Trava and really just help a lot of our customers get through the compliance process.
Fantastic. So the perfect person to talk to about this stuff, especially as it relates to compliance. So let's go ahead and dive right on in. Let's start with the basics. What is an asset inventory?
So an asset inventory is basically just a list of all your enterprise hardware and software.
And what does enterprise mean in this instance?
Just your company, your organization, whatever. So just every device and software that everyone has.
Again, very basic question. What is asset management?
So in cybersecurity, this refers to all the policies, processes, and tools that are needed to keep an updated list of all the hardware and software within the organization. It is all about identifying, tracking, and managing the hardware and software that you guys own.
Fantastic. Are there different categories of assets that organizations should consider?
So when it comes to assets, there are software and hardware inventories that we talked about already that the business should keep up to date for security best practices. Besides those, there's typically maybe like data inventories you'll hear about, but that's typically when people are trying to focus more on privacy because you have to know what data you're collecting and where you're collecting it. So that's where those come into play.
Okay. So I feel like this might be a simple question and half the listeners probably already know, but for my own sake, I'm going to ask to make sure that I understand. So what is the difference between like hardware and software inventories?
Yeah, so hardware is really, it's the physical devices. So like hard, that's what I think about. If I can physically hold it, like a computer or any sort of like hardware with like cables that they like a router or something that someone has back in the back closet, that's your hardware. Software is just anything that you would install on to those devices. So when you would use like different components like Slack or Google Drive or something that someone might have downloaded on their computer, that would be a software, something that helps their device run or that make their website run.
All right. So how does having a comprehensive asset inventory contribute to someone's overall cybersecurity posture?
Yeah, you touched on it briefly at the beginning, but you cannot protect what you do not know you have or what you own. Keeping the inventory up to date, make sure that you have all possible points of entry covered and accounted for. Similar to a building, when people try to put safeguards for a building, you're doing it, but just like on a network that you can't really physically see. If you're missing an asset, that is a hole for an attacker to get into.
And we do not want to give them easy access to things for sure. How does maintaining an accurate software inventory help organizations ensure compliance with software licensing agreements?
This one could go like definitely into a deeper dive because I think software inventory goes in hand with vendor management and like vendor inventories. That's what you have to do for compliance, but it's more so evaluating the security postures of the vendors you use. It could be something you make a whole other episode about.
So, what are some common challenges organizations face when trying to establish a complete asset inventory?
There are definitely a lot of different challenges depending on the person, the company. One would be deciding how you are going to track this inventory. So you're going to have to decide, are you going to utilize a tool or is this something you're going to track manually, like in a spreadsheet? Another challenge I also see is when getting started is just tracking down all assets for a company. If they do not have a list already started, it can be pretty time consuming to get it up and running. So, especially if you have more than just laptops to include in that hardware inventory, it gets a little bit more hectic. And I think people also struggle on getting the proper identification when they're running a BYOD, so bring your own device company. Those devices can be harder to track and monitor when they're not company owned. Knowing what IPs are coming into your network is really important. And a lot of times, like the employee on the other side probably does not know their IP address or how to find it, but Google's there to help. And another challenge would be keeping up consistent reviews of that inventory and keeping that up to date. So auditors look for specific cadences depending on the framework to make sure the company's staying compliant. So making sure that they're updating that list at least on a quarterly basis is pretty typical.
So you mentioned BYOD, which stands for Bring Your Own Device. So how does this BYOD policies complicate the task of maintaining like a asset inventory exactly?
It definitely has the pros and the cons. It really just complicates the processes because it's not easy to add agents to monitor those devices. So you're making this list to make sure you're tracking everyone, and you're not necessarily wanting to see what they're doing every day all the time. It's more so to check the security and making sure the bad guys aren't getting into your system. The barrier is like trusting your employees to give you the correct identification numbers and actually make sure they install the correct agents and softwares that will be monitoring their devices for the security aspect.
Got it. So definitely have to stay on top of your employees to make sure they're giving you the right info. So Marie, when we were talking about the challenges, you mentioned that sometimes people use like a tool to track or do it manually. From your experience, what one is like better?
It really just depends on the person. Like, how do you like to stay organized? Some people love tools, softwares of every kind. Some people love spreadsheets. So, a lot of companies choose to do it manually on spreadsheets, is what I typically see. There are templates all over the internet that can help guide you to do that. It's a free way to do it too. You just have to make sure you're putting it in your calendar to do it, review it, and add new ones on a timely manner. Some companies also choose to use a tool though, and that's pretty easy too if you have the ability and if it's like in the budget to use it. So there's a lot of functionality there. There's a lot of endpoint protection and detection softwares that have the capability, or mobile device management solutions. And there's even some GRC compliance tools that have the functionality to help companies track and monitor those devices.
As I've been doing like research about like asset management and things, I've noticed the words or phrase shadow IT pop up a lot. What is shadow IT and how does it pose a challenge to traditional asset management and cybersecurity efforts?
It's a great question because the name sounds scary, and it is scary in a sense. This is when someone starts using technology without letting their IT team know. They're connecting it to the company network and to the company data. So sometimes this is done to bypass restrictions and limitations that your IT and security teams put into place. Not all the time would someone be doing this maliciously, but it is a possibility that someone's doing it for the wrong reasons. Some people just do it unknowingly, though. Some people just do it to know better. They don't know better, and they're realizing that they don't realize they're putting a risk to their company by doing it. So that's why it's called like a shadow IT, because you're hidden. And a lot of the times it creates another hole in your network. It's a place attackers can get into because not all the security measures are put onto that device. So that's really why it becomes a huge risk.
How can organizations detect the risks associated with shadow IT?
The asset inventories themselves. So, like knowing the IPs of your company devices is really big because otherwise they can block the ones that they know aren't belonging to them. So that's why the asset inventory is so good, because it really does help your security team and your IT team of knowing who is who and if you should really be accessing this. So when the shadow IT devices are trying to access something, or they're able to get in because they have someone's credentials, like typically if they have their security all set up, it will send off alerts saying there's suspicious activity coming from an unknown device that we do not track.
The last couple questions I have are like all geared more towards compliance. In the context of compliance, how does asset management contribute to maintaining compliance with industry specific regulations?
So most frameworks, regulations, and standards require that you keep different types of inventories like hardware, software, and data, like we talked about earlier. This is because most of these compliance frameworks focus on the fact that you put security and privacy measures in place to monitor access and all other activity. So that's really big for your consumers to know that you're tracking this somehow.
How does maintaining a comprehensive asset inventory align with cybersecurity compliance standards?
Standards require that you track and harden all your endpoints. It's a best practice all around. So this means your assets such as laptops typically. And then if you're missing one because you do not know it exists and you don't do the routine checks or one is not being kept up to date, this creates that hole in the architecture of your security.
And we don't want any holes.
Nope. Holes because typically they're big holes too. So it's just so easy. Like an attacker can find them so easily. It's crazy.
Yeah, just thinking back on BYOD and in the context of compliance, how can organizations balance the benefits of a BYOD policy with the challenges of posing to maintain a secure and compliant asset inventory?
BYOD is very typical, especially this days with remote working. A lot of companies choose BYOD just to give the employees like the flexibility on the device choice that they want, and also based off like a financial and budgeting reason. So it's doable to keep up to date inventories and monitoring of those devices. It just takes the responsibility of the employee to allow you to add specific software to monitor them. So it's a lot of trust in those employees. I see this done a lot easier on smaller teams typically, but if you have a strong IT and security team, to keep it all organized, it could be done well on a larger team too. It can be successful either way. But like anything, when it comes to security, your people are both your weakest and strongest links. So it's really all about a team effort.
It is a team effort. That's actually something Jim and I talked about in a previous episode. Like cybersecurity for a company isn't just on the back of the IT team, it's like the whole company.
Trying to get everyone to that understanding that this is really important. And typically people don't know it's important until the bad things happen to them. And they're like, oh, now I get it. But we want to try to get that before bad things happen.
So again, we talked previously about manual and tools and what's right for a company, but can you elaborate on the role of automated tools and technologies in streamlining asset management tasks and ensuring that compliance is continuous when it comes to that?
So these tools really help with the monitoring aspect when it comes to management. These tools are nice to directly tell you which endpoint has fallen out of compliance. And this is typically done with notifications or like distinct colors that indicate which user device is not accurate. As someone who acts as an internal auditor for a lot of customers, that's me. I think it saves a lot of people from getting caught in the audit with having a missing device from the list. It's really easy to have an indicator of which employee like maybe doesn't have their device connected or that they're missing like an IP for their employee, and you can just easily tell if someone's missing. So the automation in that is really nice, and like also keeping track that you are checking them on like a quarterly basis and making sure you're getting that information on onboarding and taking it offboarding points. The tool is just really good at sending you those reminders. So that automation is nice because you don't have to think of it yourself.
And we love a good reminder, especially when it comes to cybersecurity things. Like the one thing I'm learning from hosting the podcast is there are like so many little steps and it's easy to miss sometimes. So a reminder is fantastic.
Yeah, it is. Especially like all the colors too. I'm like, yeah, put it in red if I'm missing something, please.
So again, we know that I'm new to this whole asset inventory, asset management arena, but I know that you handle a lot of our customers and things like that through compliance. So is there anything else you would like someone to know, like a best practices or something about like asset inventories?
Just that they seem really silly and it's like, why do I have to make this list? But they're pretty important. Like you need to track everything you own just because of that hole that we talked about so much at the beginning. Like you don't want to have that hole there, and you want to know what your employees are using, what they're doing in a sense too, just for security wise. Is someone putting on a shadow IT component that we talked about earlier? Because in a lot of cases, they're probably not doing it maliciously. So just making the understanding that we just need to know to keep us all safe. And I think just like a reminder that you cannot be secure if you're not tracking every single asset or a device that is connected to your network. And this remains true even if you're working in the fully cloud environment and you're fully remote. Tracking all these things is still really important. You do have assets, even if you are remote and in the cloud, because sometimes I think that's something people don't really understand. They think they're in the cloud, so everything's already protected, but that's just not how it works.
It's definitely not how it works. And listeners, we will actually dive more into like cloud and vendor and third party security in an episode coming up. So stay tuned. Well, Marie, I definitely appreciate your time and helping me and the listeners understand more about asset inventories. Thank you.
Thank you. It's great seeing you again, Jara.
Nice seeing you. Now that we've spilled the tea on asset inventories and management, it's time to go over the receipts. As I mentioned during the conversation with Marie, asset inventories is a new concept that I've come across during my journey with understanding not only cybersecurity, but security compliance as well. So there are several things that I pulled out from this conversation. First receipt that I have is what is an asset inventory? And it's honestly just a list of all the hardware and software that a company may use. Marie also talked about that sometimes these can be time consuming, especially if you're doing it for the first time. And another challenge that people typically have is the upkeep of this. So you can either set a reminder on your calendar, or if you're using a tool, a lot of the times she mentioned that they can send you a reminder to review this information. Another receipt that I have from the conversation was about BYOD, which has pros and cons. When you're allowed to bring your own device, employees are able to choose what type of software, what type of computer, or whatever they would like to have. And it's honestly less money for the company because they don't have to provide a bunch of equipment for people. But on the flip side of that, it is hard for a company to be able to keep track of all of this hardware and software an employee has when they bring their own device, which also leads into shadow IT, which is another thing I took away from the conversation. So that is just when employees may be using like software or hardware that's not necessarily tracked or given the green light from the company. And so they're not really being seen. Sometimes that doesn't pop up with like asset inventories, which adds other holes for the bad guys to get in. And the last thing I took away from this conversation was about how this all relates to standards when it comes to compliance. A lot of the standards require you to have a list of your assets to make sure that there are no holes, like I just mentioned, that can be infiltrated due to shadow IT and other things. I hope you got as much from this conversation with Marie about assets as I did. Next up on the T on cybersecurity, we're going to dive more into incident response plans and tabletop exercises. I'll see you there. And that's the T on cybersecurity. If you like what you listen to, please leave a review. If you need anything else from me, head on over to Trava Security. Follow wherever you get your podcasts.